Welcome, everyone. Let's get started. This is the Spring WAP Research Seminar Series, Fairness and Meritocracy at Work. My name is Siri Shalazi. I'm a senior researcher at the Women in Public Policy program and co-author, together with Iris Bennett, of Make Work Fair, Data-Driven Design for Real Results. I'm thrilled that you're joining us for today's discussion, which is going to be very special. We have an amazing guest for you. As those of you who have joined us before know, this semester, as part of this seminar, we explore how organizations can build fair and merit-based workplaces, both looking at the barriers that can get in the way and also identifying concrete interventions and solutions that can help us create workplaces that truly provide equal opportunities for everyone. We are thrilled and excited today to have Professor Corinne Low joining us. Corinne is an associate professor of business economics and public policy at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. There, she teaches an award-winning class on the economics of gender and discrimination, which I think we're going to hear a little bit about today. Corinne's research has been published in the top journals, and her first book, which is a USA Today national bestseller and an Amazon Best Book of the Year, is called Having It All: What Data Tells Us About Women's Lives and Getting the Most Out of Yours. I cannot recommend this book highly enough. It's incisive, it's evidence-based, it's deeply human, and it's essential reading for all women everywhere. And I know that Corinne is going to share some more insights from the book with us today, so we're very lucky. In addition to speaking to us today, Corinne regularly speaks to and advises firms, in addition to also teaching in Wharton's executive education programs. She received her PhD in economics from Columbia University, her BS also in economics and public policy from Duke University, and she formerly worked for McKinsey and Company. Today, Corinne will share a little bit about her research on the division of household labor from a great paper titled Winning the Bread and Breaking It Too. And as we discussed, insights from her book, Having It All. Corinne will speak for about 45 to 50 minutes. And during this talk, if at any point you have questions, please pop them in using the Q&A function. So not the chat, but the Q&A function. And I will ask them of Corinne as we go along. So whether that's clarifying questions or content questions related to the content, please pop them into the Q&A function. And with that, Corinne, welcome. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Siri. I'm so excited to be here with all of you. I'm going to share my slides. And so I'm going to start by telling you about one of the research papers that kind of is the underlying research in the book. So I'm going to start with this research paper that Siri mentioned, Winning the Bread and Baking It Too. And this research paper really starts from the perspective of the puzzle that women's labor force participation and earnings were kind of growing very sharply until about 2000. And progress has really leveled off and plateaued since then. At the same time, in marriage. And it's that as women's earning power grows, men may not want to marry these higher earning women, right? But we kind of have a different take on this puzzle, which is that if gender roles have converged in the workplace, but they haven't converged at home, marriage may offer less advantages than it used to, especially to couples that would have a higher earning female partner. And I'll show you why. And then the fact that in those high female earning partnerships, you don't have men's gender roles changing at home, then becomes a key friction in women's progress at work. So, you can look at it as everything that this whole seminar series is doing about redesigning the workplace, and I'll talk about that as well. It's like clearing the field, right? And you kind of have a track and field race, and it's getting those obstacles out of the way. But whatever's happening in the home means that the runner's legs might still be tied together. And if we don't solve that problem, then clearing the field, may not ultimately result in workplace equality. So that's why I think it's important to talk about these home issues here in this workplace focused seminar. So just to show you what I'm talking about when I say a gender revolution at work and for women, but not a gender revolution at home. If you go back to 1975, you see that women did a lot of housework and men didn't do very much. And men did a lot of market work and women did much less. And now women's roles have changed women have increased their market work by about 15 hours a week, and they've decreased their time on housework by about 15 hours a week. So those two changes about cancel each other out. But when you look at men's roles, you'll notice that they really haven't changed. So men spend about the same amount of time at work as they did in 1975, but they also do almost the same amount of housework. It wasn't that women spent less time and then men spent more time, right? Men's time has stayed pretty stable. Part of the reason for that is that women were able to replace some of their time with technology. And obviously, this is a big topic of conversation right now. We're in the midst of another kind of massive technological step forward. But what I'm talking about here is like a little bit more basic technology, the vacuum cleaner, the washer dryer, the dishwasher, and the microwave, which took the place once those became prevalent in American homes. Some of that was able to take the place of female labor. So that's part of the reason why women have been able to enter the labor force or increase their market work time. But I don't think it tells the whole story. So in other research, I look at how the marriage contract has actually changed over time. And what I find is that today's marriage contract is much less secure than the marriage contract prior to the 1970s. And what that means is that specialization, where one person focuses on home production, the children, taking care of the house, and the other person focuses on market production, labor that they get paid for in formal employment, that becomes a very risky bargain if you don't have a secure marriage contract, because it means that, as happened to a lot of these women who in the 1970s, when the divorce revolution initially started, you could end up starting over in your 40s with a minimum wage job because you have invested in your children's human capital. You've invested in your husband's human capital by making sure that everything was always taken care of around the house, but you haven't invested in your own human capital. And so this paper by a researcher, Marianne Bronson, called Degrees Are Forever, so diamonds aren't forever, degrees are forever, points out that this explosion in women going to college and, in fact, going at higher rates than men exactly follows the number of people who are divorced or the number of divorces that are taking place. And so it's a different type of market pressure acting on women to kind of shove them into the labor force. We always talk a little bit about the kind of carrot side of like, oh, you get replaced by this great technology, you have more time. Now you can enter the labor force. We don't talk as much about this side, which is that you need to, the stick side, which is that for women, this bargain of, home specialization was no longer such a good deal. And so they needed to enter the labor force. And I think because there was no corresponding pressure on men, that's part of the reason for this half-baked or unfinished gender revolution, is that women needed to enter the labor force, so their labor force participation evolved very rapidly, but the systems and the support at home that we might have needed to support that didn't actually take place, nor did some of the changes that we needed actually in the labor market. And a lot of those changes were made by force, by women, advocating for it, such as, sexual harassment laws and anti-discrimination laws. But a lot of the deeper structural changes haven't happened. And that's some of what we'll revisit later on in the talk. So this partial gender revolution, women changing roles, men not changing roles, meant that for couples where there is a female breadwinner, women end up winning the bread and breaking and baking it too. So let me show you, and this is from that paper of the same name, that when you have a couple that has a straight male breadwinner, whoever's the breadwinner does less housework, and this is cooking and cleaning, and whoever's not the breadwinner does much more. That's that home specialization. And this doesn't mean she doesn't work. She's just not the breadwinner. Lesbian couples, you see a similar thing, although lesbian couples are less specialized. They're more egalitarian in terms of housework. And in gay male couples, you see the same thing. But if you are in a straight couple with a female breadwinner, that's the only couple type where the breadwinner actually is the one who does more housework, who does more cooking and cleaning. And I thought it was important to point out here that this is not driven by childcare, because a lot of people think like, oh, childcare is somewhat by its nature gendered because women give birth and they breastfeed and they're the ones who take maternity leave. But this is, as I said, cooking and cleaning. So my joke in the book is that I don't sweep the floor with my uterus. There's nothing, inherently biologically gendered about these tasks. But in fact, the gender gap in cooking and cleaning is larger than the gender gap in childcare. So this gender norm appears to be more immovable than the gender norm in childcare. And it's important to note because people also often talk about child penalties where they say, like, well, maybe she's just kind of temporarily a breadwinner. That this is, oh, I went in the wrong order. I'm going to show this first. I'll go back. That this is not driven by anticipation of future child penalties or by her just being a temporary breadwinner. When we look at women who are still breadwinners after they have kids, so childless women, they show this pattern. The breadwinner does more when she's a woman. When they have young kids, if she's still a breadwinner, she has more. But even if she has kids over 5 and she's still a breadwinner, so we've now selected for the people who've kind of survived that child penalty and she's still the breadwinner, she still does more. So it's not driven by anticipation. We also show that it's true for women who are long-term breadwinners, not just like kind of temporary breadwinners. We also use these marriage and divorce events to show that this doesn't appear to be driven by preferences. So a lot of people will say, well, she just likes it to be clean, or she just likes to cook. Okay, let me tell you something. Everybody likes to cook. Nobody likes feeding a toddler 3 meals and 2 snacks a day, okay? And really nobody likes to sweep. So I don't know if I believe these preferences thing, but some people say, okay, well, it's about the outcome, right? It's about like, oh, she wants it to be cleaner. Well, this is where I think these marriage and divorce events are telling because what you see is that it's not just that women increase their time once they're married, because you could say, oh, he's messy, she's cleaning up after him. It's that men decrease their time. Okay. So it's not that men just maintain the same level of messiness, but then, women like want to clean up after them because they have different preferences. It's that men actually stop cleaning as much once they get married. So it is that like specialization of, he's turning over the cleaning tasks to her. But what that tells me is that it says when he was living by himself, he actually wanted it neater, right, than what he's doing with his own behavior once he gets married because he's happy to kind of pass that task on to her. We see the same thing upon divorce, and this one really surprised me because in divorce, often women become the custodial parents of children. But what we see is that when women get divorced, their time cooking and cleaning goes down drastically. So even though they go from having, two able-bodied adults in the household to just one, okay, what you see is that their time goes down because the man, rather than being a net producer or provider of household labor, was a creator of labor. He was a net consumer of the household labor. And so she really was cooking and cleaning after him. And that's why her time goes down. And again, we see that his time goes up. So when he's divorced, not a preference issue, he realizes, oh, I've got to find the broom or I've got to do my laundry if I want to have clean clothes. So not driven by preferences, doesn't appear to be driven by temporary breadwinner status or anticipation of child penalties. Our next hypothesis was, could this be a matter of comparative advantage? So absolute advantage would be the story that it's actually that she earns less, that's why she does more, right? But what if it's that she could earn more, but she has such a strong productivity advantage in home production that it's still efficient for her to essentially be a net exporter of home production, even though she has this productivity advantage. So comparative advantage, comes from the trade literature. So think about the fact that even though the United States might have an absolute advantage in both goods and services, they're going to export services and import goods because of this comparative advantage in services, right? So is it possible that what's going on here is comparative advantage? So just to show you a quick like little equation of what would happen if this was comparative advantage, the idea would be these first order stats represent the amount of time you're going to put into home production. And that amount of time you're going to put in is going to be proportional to the woman's productivity advantage, or sorry, the men's productivity disadvantage in home production times the woman's wage divided by the men's wage. And so what this says is if she has a wage advantage, but let's say it's like 1.5 to 1, okay? But then his productivity disadvantage is that he's half as productive as she is. Then the fact that he's half as productive and she's only 1.5 more productive in the labor market means that she could put more time into home production than he does, right? But the key thing here is that that's going to vary with the wage ratio. If I ramp up her advantage from 1.5 to 3, now the fact that he's half as productive at home isn't a good enough reason for her to be doing all the home production because she still now has that advantage in the labor market, even if it takes him, twice as long to do stuff around the house, she's 3 times as productive in the labor market, right? So we wanted to test this by looking at whether their time allocation at home varied with the wage ratio. So we take couples and we go from couples where the wage ratio is a quarter, that she earns a quarter to a half of what he earns. She earns a half to parity with what he earns. She earns 1 to 2 times what he earns, or she earns 2 to 4 times what he earns. Okay. And what we see,
Corinne, I
yes,
apologize. Can I interrupt with a quick clarifying
please,
question?
yes.
Um, we're talking about housework. Does this also take into consideration the who bears the cognitive load? So who remembers to schedule appointments, find the camps, the extracurriculars, and things like that?
It's a great question. So this is data from the American Time Use Study. Does not do a good job capturing things like mental load. It really only captures the actual time doing those tasks. But the reason I focus on cooking and cleaning, these sort of rote everyday tasks, is that they seem to track the mental load division a lot better than the big obvious tasks like dropping the kid off at daycare. It's more easy to divide that evenly. And in fact, some of the other chores that are weekly and monthly or even annually, like mowing the lawn or cleaning out the gutters. We see men spend more time on those things. But these things that are every day, every hour that you have to do, tidying, folding laundry, like I said, packing the toddler's snacks for daycare, those are things where we see this highly gendered division. And so I do think if you included the mental load, it would follow this pattern. But what I like about this category of cooking and cleaning is I've found a place where in this category, you see exactly the same problems people talk about with the mental load. You don't see it as much with actual childcare because, again, I think it's easier to divide childcare to say you're with them for 2 hours, I'm with them for 2 hours, versus these sort of routine everyday tasks that just become invisible that she's really the one doing them all the time. Thanks for the great question. And please chime in if more questions come up. So I was just saying that this is the men's time doing housework, doing that cooking and cleaning. And this graph is a shocking graph. As anybody who's an economist, right, we know that you should be sort of maximizing according to the price that you pay for something. And as her wage ratio increases, the price that you're paying for her to spend all that time on housework is going up and up and up. But his time doing housework is not budging. Her time goes down a little bit. That's because of outsourcing, but his time doing housework, it just doesn't budge. And then when you go on the flip side of market work, and this is the place where I think it's good to note that I think men are trapped in these restrictive gender roles as well. What you see is that even when she's earning more than twice his wage, he still works more hours than she does. So that right side is market work, and he's working more hours no matter what the wage ratio is, right? Which is really inefficient for the household. So, to kind of spell out just how inefficient this is, I want to look at hourly workers. These are workers where they're paid according to the shift that they work. They're not on salary. And so, ostensibly, they can kind of scale up and down their work. And that's important because some people ask, well, for men, is that are they kind of trapped in these 40-hour-a-week jobs where there's no way for them to kind of adjust it? If they wanted to take on more housework. So these are hourly workers, and the modal couple in this data of this type would be like she's in healthcare, he's in transportation. So she's a nurse, he's an Uber driver. And what you see is, again, when her hourly wage is more than twice his hourly wage, right? So let's say, she's making $60 an hour as a nurse and he's making $25 an hour as an Uber driver. Not only is she doing more than double the housework, but he's still working more hours than she is. And if he would clean up after the kids or do a load of laundry, she could pick up a shift as a nurse and the whole household would be richer. So this is where you see that this inability to kind of allocate this task, these home production tasks, is actually holding back the efficiency of the couple, right? So this couple is actually less efficient, and it's almost as if they're poorer because if you had a couple where the wages were allocated the other way, he earned $60 an hour and she earned $25 an hour, right? It would be cheaper for that couple to purchase the home production because they're only paying the opportunity cost of her $25 an hour wage for the home production that they want to have. But in this couple, they're paying that $60 an hour. They're giving up that $60 an hour for her to still do the home production. So the couple is actually poor. And so we hypothesize that this might be a key friction of why people kind of don't want to get married when the wife is going to earn more money. So we have this large literature at this point showing that lower income for men is tied to lower marriage rates. But the question is, is this really about stigma when women earn more, or is some of this about this friction in reallocating home production and it being kind of inefficient to actually operate the household when she is earning more and she's still getting stuck kind of doing all of the home production? So, and feel free to jump in if there's any other questions. So, I'm going to do this empirical exercise where we're going to exploit the fact that in different countries, there's different norms about how much home production men do. They never do more than women, they never do as much as women, but there's actually tremendous variation. So, let me show you a graph of that. So, the ratio of female to male unpaid care time in India is almost 10 to 1. Whereas if you go to Uganda, which you wouldn't necessarily think of as a bastion of gender equality, it's only 1.2 to 1. Okay, so there's a lot of variation in how I would say how much, but really how little men do in different countries. And we're going to exploit that variation by looking at immigrants to the US. And what we're going to do is we're going to see the way that the female to male wage ratio in local marriage markets in the US, how does that impact marriage rates when you interact it with the different levels of home production that the men are going to be willing to do? Okay. So, immigrants to the US, we're going to look at local marriage markets. Some cities, you see that Korean American men are doctors, and some cities, Korean American men are waiters, and that's going to determine what that male to female ratio is. And it's kind of specific to those local marriage markets. So, what we find is that it's true that having a high female to male wage ratio is associated with lower marriage rates in that local marriage market, but it's much stronger when you interact it with the home production ratio from the home country. So that home production ratio from the home country, women doing a lot more, it's when women do a lot more at home that it becomes a problem for her to earn more in that local marriage market. If she just earns more and he can take on the tasks at home, it's kind of fine. But if she earns more and they are immigrants from India where he's not going to take on any of the home production, then it's more likely she's going to either never marry or she's actually going to marry outside of her ethnic group to maybe find somebody where either the earnings ratio is different or the home production ratio is going to be different. And to explicitly test this alternate hypothesis that has to do with earnings stigma, that you just don't like it when women earn more money and you think that's kind of like shameful, we actually use a measure of that earning stigma from the World Values Survey, and we find that that is not significantly associated with less marriage when she earns more. So we think that this home production channel is a really important and overlooked channel of why people don't want to get married when women earn more money. And the last thing I'll say before I end this section and take some questions is that this is an existential problem because marriage and fertility rates are falling around the world. And you can imagine that as women's earning power grows, that this problem just becomes more and more salient, right? In an economy where the way you earn money is with your physical labor, men are endowed with a labor market advantage. Men naturally are endowed with more earnings capacity in that economy. But as the economy transitions to one where the way that you earn money is with your knowledge, with your mental labor, men are not endowed with a natural advantage in that domain. And so this problem that has already reared its head in the US, in Germany, in Korea, is going to be rearing its head in more and more countries because as those economies transition to more knowledge-based economies, men lose their absolute advantage in the labor market. And if men cannot learn to take on other roles, to be a provider in the household by taking things off her plate so she can earn money in the labor market, then I think it's going to spell very bad news for marriage and fertility. And I actually think this is incredibly important on the cusp of this AI revolution because we don't know what jobs AI is going to take. And some of them might be male jobs, right? Healthcare, for example, which a lot of women are in, is a job that's going to be in some ways AI proof because a lot of it is actually about providing care, right? At the point of care, physical labor and care. But some male jobs like computer programming, like accounting, like basic financial services may be getting replaced by AI. And so there are going to be households where the man's earning power is going to plummet and the woman's earning power is going to stay constant. How are those households going to approach that? And are we going to finish this unfinished gender revolution? And that's literally going to determine not just the future of the gender wage gap and women in the workplace. I think it's going to determine the future of humanity because this is so essential for our species to continue to propagate. So, on that note, I'm going to pause this section, take your questions, and then I'm going to move on to talking about the book.
I love that you make the stakes so clear, Corinne. Thank you. Staying on this topic of marriage rates, how much do you think dating preferences, so to speak, play into this phenomenon? So we typically have this idea that men date down, economically speaking, whereas women would prefer to date either horizontally or upwards. Do you think there's anything there?
Yeah, well, I actually have data to answer that question because my dissertation was about dating preferences, and I was showing that there was a trade-off between human capital and what I call reproductive capital, which is strongly linked to age. And what I showed is that men do not have a negative preference over women's earnings. And, as an economist, that makes sense. It's like everybody thinks more money is good. So men don't have as strong of a preference for women's earnings as women have for men's earnings, but men do not have a negative preference over women's earnings. So men, all else equal, want somebody who earns more money. And I think that's what a little bit of the myth we're trying to bust here is that this is about men not liking it when she earns money. What we see in the data is that he's not unhappy when she earns money, but it's just that he's not going to take on the housework. And so what happens is the
Mm.
household becomes less efficient and she gets kind of increasingly tired. And, maybe that's what starts kind of producing fights or producing that marital dissolution.
That's a really helpful answer. So going back to this question of the housework and the division of household labor, is there anything to sort of the threshold that activates somebody's preferences for doing tasks? So there's a great example here in the question about,
Mhm.
let's say, before marriage and post divorce, my preference is to do the dishes every other day. So left to my own devices, I would do the dishes every other day. But now I'm married to someone who wants to do them every day. And
Yeah.
so because that person's threshold is lower, they just end up doing the dishes even
Yeah.
though I theoretically would have stepped up on my own
Yeah.
timeline.
No, this is what economists would call kind of a war of attrition. And it's like if you have the higher pain tolerance, you win the war of attrition every time. And that absolutely could be one of the mechanisms happening here. So there's some reason, right, why men do these tasks when they're on their own, but they don't do them when they're in a heterosexual partnership. By the way, interestingly, in homosexual partnerships, we don't see that same pattern. So in homosexual partnerships, when the man gets laid off, we see him taking on more of the home production. But in heterosexual partnerships, even when the man is laid off, we see actually his leisure go up a lot, but we don't see him doing a lot of the housework. So, yes, it's possible that this kind of war of attrition logic is part of the reason for it. And that still represents kind of a structural inefficiency, right? And so that's why for the household, for the household to function as productively as possible and to get maximize the household's income earning frontier, right? It should be that even if he knows, well, it's actually her preference that the dishes get done once a day, he should be willing to do it to free up her time to actually work in the labor market. But in order to do that, you have to kind of break out of those gender roles that say, well, you're less of a man if you're working less in the labor market.
Thank you. A quick reminder to everyone to please put your questions into the Q&A function and we'll take them now and then also at the end of the talk. I'll ask you one more, Corinne, for now. There's a question about this comparative advantage argument. Does that depend at all on the nature of the tasks and specifically how easy it is to split a task up? So, for example, cooking might be very hard to scale down because it's kind of hard to make half of a dish or a meal at a time. You're just going to end up cooking the whole meal for everybody.
Well, I guess the way I think about it is that there's like a number of tasks in the household. And people familiar with Eve Rodsky, that she has her like 1,000 card deck. And when you start looking at that, you're like, oh wow, there's a lot of granular, individual tasks that you can actually split up in the household. And so you should be able to transition, maybe you can't transition all of cooking, but you transition, school breakfasts or school lunches to one person, right? And then next you transition snacks, and then you transition, taking care of signing up for activities or chauffeuring to soccer practice, right? So there should be these kind of little things that you can kind of slide over to somebody else's plate to kind of make those adjustments. But Yeah, I think, and there was this great paper that people are probably familiar with. I don't know if you had it in your series, but by Laura Gee and Olga Stoddard, where they showed that like one of the problems is as much as you might try to make that switch, it's about the principal always calling the mom first, right? The problem is the outside world might not let you make that switch. So I absolutely believe there's some stickiness in these roles where a lot of what happens is like once mom goes on maternity leave, now she's the expert in everything. She's the only one who knows where the pacifier he likes is, or she's the only one who knows where the diapers are or what size clothes they are. And it becomes hard to kind of offload those tasks. So I think there absolutely is that kind of stickiness. And then when you look at the data, though, you see like how profound that inefficiency is, that we're just letting gender roles that are really a poor fit for some of those individual situations. Like I showed you the couples where, she might be earning 3 times what he's earning, and that gender role is a poor fit for their situation, but they maybe haven't been able to make that change.
Thank you.
So I'm going to zoom out a little bit now and talk about my book, which, covers not just my research, but research from other scholars, and to talk about why having it all is harder than ever for women. Okay. So one of the forces that we talked about was the fact that as women's gender roles have changed in the workplace, men's haven't changed. And I always find it ironic that given like some of those structural barriers, when I look at the books that are written for women, even books I love, so don't mean to criticize these books, I love Women Don't Ask, but they always sound like they're yelling at me, right? They're like, nice girls don't get the corner office. Girls, stop apologizing. Women don't ask. Lean in. And they're saying, like, you are the problem. You need to overcome these structural challenges by working harder. And even recently, we saw that Lean In put out this report saying that there's an ambition gap for women. And that's, part of what's driving the gender wage gap is that women aren't ambitious enough. So, as a counter to that, I love this paper. It's a very important paper by Nobel Prize winner Claudia Golden and her husband Larry, and Marianne Bertrand, that shows that when you track men's and women's performance in terms of their salary after they earn MBAs from this is Chicago Booth, so not quite the HBSs and Whartons of the world. I'm just kidding, but they you see that there's very little gender wage gap right when they graduate. Okay. And so this open triangle is the male mean, and this closed triangle is the female mean. And they're actually very close together. But those gaps open up tremendously over the course of their careers. So much so that when you go 13 years after an MBA, the female 90th percentile in earnings is the same as the male mean. I think it's very telling to look at the female 90th percentile in earnings because those are the women who leaned in. Those are the women who exhibited grit. Those are the women who prioritized career over family. Those are the women who, quote, made all the right choices. And yet they are facing structural barriers. They are still hitting this kind of glass ceiling. You can see it looks like a ceiling. Their curves kind of level off in their earning power. So, what are some of those forces that are making it structurally hard for women to earn as much as men? One of them is this tremendous explosion in parenting time that we have seen over the last 30 years. And yes, 1995 was 30 years ago. So, starting in the early 1990s, time with our children exploded. It increased for both women and for men. Our time with our children doubled. Every parent on here, knows the extended bedtime routine of reading a million stories and processing highs and lows. I grew up in the 1980s before this changed, so my bedtime routine was go to bed. Okay. I was out biking. My mom didn't know where I was. And that's not how we parent today, right? And so I kind of represented this a little bit by us going from the Dr. Spock's baby and childcare, which was basically keep your child alive, to this kind of intensive attachment parenting of, Dr. Sears. Dads have increased their caregiving time as well. And so I think this leads to some misunderstandings in the household because dads are like, I read the kid a bedtime story. My dad never did that. I'm an amazing dad. But they don't realize that their wives' time has increased so much more that the gender gap in the household has actually gotten wider instead of narrower. This time with our kids has increased so dramatically that working moms today, that's this bar, spend more time with our kids than stay-at-home moms in 1975. So stay-at-home moms spend on average 10 hours a week. This is active childcare. I know that might sound small, but on active childcare, and working moms today spend more like 14 hours a week. working dads spent almost as much time as stay-at-home moms in 1975. So that is a huge investment that we're making in child human capital. And for someone to make that investment in child human capital, we might not be able to invest as much in our own human capital, which is part of what you see when it comes to careers. I just am going to show you this data because I think it's really interesting in terms of where is this increase coming from. So I broke this down again using the American Time Use Survey, and what we find is that the categories that have increased the most are travel. So we live further away from activities and our kids do more activities today. Anybody who has the kid on a travel soccer team, which is ruining my life currently, knows about this. Help with homework, a category that basically didn't exist in 1975. The kids were on their own. And as we've increased kind of educational investments and our expectation that parents make those investments, playing with our children, another category that barely existed in 1975 and is now huge today. And that has to do with the structure of our communities. It has to do with norms. But something I just, observe in myself is how often am I acting as playmate to my child versus, them playing with other kids. And then infant care, which has a lot to do with our understanding of child development, that we know you need to hold babies and talk to them and, spend one-on-one time with toddlers. If you think about daycare in the 1980s, it was perfectly acceptable to have 30 infants with one caregiver kind of handing them each a bottle assembly line style. Now we have a 4-to-1 infant to caregiver ratio because we know that infants need so much more, which is what's causing childcare costs to skyrocket, but it's also implicating women's time. In the 1990s, less than 20% of women were breastfeeding at 6 months. Now 60% of mothers do. So that is intensive. That is our time. I have a 10-month-old and I'm still pumping, while I'm back at work. So huge additional occupation of mother's time through childcare that's coming in, which creates what I call the squeeze. So this is time use data again, but it looks at it over the life cycle. And what it shows is that around midlife, and this varies based on when you have your kids, we have this mountain of childcare and housework time. That when we have multiple kids at home, we have this mountain of childcare and housework time. But it's at the time when our careers are still growing, represented by this income line, which is still increasing. So we still need to make investments at work. And so we feel like our time is really scarce in both directions. But because those investments haven't paid off yet, we also don't feel like we can throw money at the problem. Whereas I show this later period I call the ironic relief, which is once your kids go to school, you're not paying for daycare anymore, and your career investments start to pay off, you have more time and more money. And the squeeze intersects with what Claudia Goldin again calls greedy jobs. So if you look at the gender wage gap, it's not equal across all industries. There's industries like being a pharmacist or a vet tech or a healthcare social worker where there's no gender wage gap, where women earn the same amount as men. But then there's industries where women earn only 60 cents on men's dollar. And those are industries in the finance industry, for example. Claudia Goldin documented the characteristics of those industries that account for there being either a large or small gender difference. And what she showed is that the characteristics that created what she calls convex returns to hours, which means that it's more efficient to have one worker working 80 hours than two workers each working 40 hours. And that's what drives the gender wage gap. And those conditions are time pressure, contact with others, establishing and maintaining interpersonal relationships, unstructured work, and freedom to make decisions. Because all of those mean that you want the one person who has the subject matter expertise, who has the leadership capability, who has the relationships with the clients. You want that one person to put in more time rather than just getting another worker to take their place. So two software engineers, each coding for 40 hours a week, produce the same code as one coding for 80 hours a week. And that's why you actually see a smaller gender gap in tech than you see in business, even though I see more discrimination, more gender discrimination in tech, but you see a smaller gender gap because of this career progression, because of the technology of the career. And of course, that's important because why is that going to drive a gender gap? Well, because this squeeze impacts men and women differently. So this now is women's minutes per day minus men's minutes per day in the same categories of childcare and housework, but now I've added work and leisure. And what you see is that in that same period where women were experiencing the squeeze, it really was a phenomenon unique to women. When I subtract out men's minutes per day, that doesn't make the hill go down, okay? So women are doing more childcare and housework across the life cycle, peaking at mid-age, but that means they're getting less time for work and they're getting less time for leisure. And the kind of tragedy of this graph is that when that time on childcare and housework comes down, women's time on work never goes back up. And part of the reason for that is that our careers are so inflexible, which is something that I'm going to talk about next. In addition to those issues, I just want to note that women also face discrimination, not just in hiring, but also in promotions. So, this is an example of maternity leave discrimination in Sweden. Sweden, a place, of course, where you might think that they have pretty good gender policies. They have long maternity leave of about a year. And these authors found that that led to firms discriminating against women in promotions, even when they didn't have any kids. Because basically, the manager would say, well, if I promote you to VP, it's going to be a lot more disruptive for the whole team when you go on maternity leave. So if I give a man the promotion instead and I keep you as an individual contributor, then it's not going to matter as much when you go on leave. So women are getting fewer promotions, even childless women who never have kids, until they hit age 40, at which point their managers are like, oh, you're not going to have kids. And we see the promotion rate kind of return to normal. And that's the important note there is that these are the women, you could say that they made all the right choices, right? But again, structural issues. And then I see in my own work that women are discriminated against in hiring, and I see that this is stronger in male-dominated industries. So I show that when you randomly assign GPAs to resumes, a woman with a 4.0 receives the same rating as a man with a 3.75. When I randomly omit GPA from resumes, a woman without GPA is treated as though she has around a 3.0. But a man who's missing his GPA is treated as though he has close to a 4.0. In the place of actual objective information, subjective beliefs are substituted in. And it reminds me of this great quote by Paul Graham, who's a famous startup investor, saying, I can get fooled by anyone who looks like Mark Zuckerberg. So if you look the part, then subjective information, the vibes are going to fill in the rest, and you're going to maybe get an opportunity you don't deserve, which of course is the opposite of meritocracy, which is what Siri and Iris's book is all about, right? Which is saying that like if you actually fix this, you get closer to meritocracy rather than farther away from it. So the last thing that I'm going to talk about before we're going to open up to questions is that I think going back to those yelling at women to change and to lean in and to act more like men, I think a lot of the stories we tell about women in the workforce are not actually evidence-based. So the idea that women need to act more like men to get ahead, I don't think there's any evidence to support either that men's traits are more effective than women or that women will be rewarded for mirroring those traits. So I'm going to take two examples. First, a canonical example from the literature that showed that men are more competitive than women. When they gave men and women an opportunity to enter a tournament versus receive a fixed payment, even very high-performing women hesitated to enter the tournament and men entered much more. But if I'm a manager, these women who didn't enter the tournament enough are not actually the people who I'm most concerned about on this graph. Who do you think I'm most concerned about on this graph? So these are high-performing men and women. Men enter much more than women. But if I go to the other end of the spectrum and I look at the low performers, the people who are certain to lose the tournament because you have to be the best in your group to win the tournament, 60% of men still enter the tournament. So 60% of the lowest performing men are like, I got this. It's going to be great. And if I'm a manager, I would be much more concerned about those men costing my firm real money than I would be about the women who kind of needed a little bit of a pep talk. But I never see the airport bestsellers targeted at men saying, men, maybe lean out just a little bit. Don't take every risk that comes along. Maybe dial back that confidence. Similarly, in my own research, I look at negotiation. I had heard the story that men were better negotiators than women and that this explained the gender wage gap more times than I can count. So I decided to look at what the evidence said. What I found is that when men negotiated against women, they got equal payoffs. They were equally good negotiators. But women walked away from my study with more dollars in their pocket than men did. Why? Because when women negotiated against other women, they also did just fine. But when men negotiated against other men, they were more than twice as likely as any other pair type to fail to reach an agreement and therefore walk away from the negotiation with nothing, which meant that on average, they earned less money from negotiating because negotiating isn't just about beating your partner, right? It's about the actual dollars that you get. And blowing up a multi-million dollar, multi-year contract because you're trying to get the extra 0.001% on the royalty contract actually still costs your firm money, even if you thought it might give you a higher chance of, quote, winning, right? So the way we define winning and losing in these sort of competitive aspects doesn't match with what actually creates value in the corporate world. But again, I never see negotiation seminars aimed at men taught by women that are about men needing to, step up their negotiating skills. So that leads me to think that some of the stories we tell about the workplace that we think are kind of core to our values and how we work are actually more like Star Wars posters. Let me explain. Research showed that girls shown in a computer science classroom that was decorated with Star Wars posters were less likely to want to take a computer science class than in a neutrally decorated classroom. So we might think that an ultra competitive work environment or an environment where we have a marketplace of ideas and the loudest voice rises to the top, we might think that that's core to what we do when actually it's more like a Star Wars poster, a relic from an era when workplaces were less diverse that's now creating unnecessary barriers to hiring and retaining the best talent. And we should think about what are the Star Wars posters that we can take down. And one of those Star Wars posters that we need to work on taking down is rigid expectations about in office work at times that do not align with childcare times. So I like to bust this myth that what women are asking for is flexibility. Because actually, if you offer women a standard 40-hour a week, 9 to 5 job, they're not willing to give up any pay to have a flexible schedule versus that standard 9 to 5. They also are willing to give up very little pay to work from home 100% of the time versus having a standard 9 to 5. But they're willing to give up more than 40% of their pay to avoid an employer discretion job where the employer can say, hey, you're working today till midnight and tomorrow you're coming in at 6 a.m. and I also need you on the weekend. Okay. So women don't want flexibility, actually, they want boundaries. And boundaries are something that firms should be able to offer. And when you talk about boundaries, it becomes more of a management challenge and less of something that we can blame women for. So I think there's a huge opportunity for firms that can rethink flexibility both during the workday by limiting FaceTime to childcare hours, avoiding unpredictable night and weekend hours through using rotating call shifts similar to the healthcare industry. And I'll talk about that more in a second. And rethinking flexibility across the life cycle to avoid having those high investment periods during the squeeze. Why can't you do the partner track in your 40s? Why can't you decide that actually you do want to be a director or a VP in your 40s? Why do we have so many one-way exits instead of having, like I show in the picture, a business track, a local track where you can move in the same direction at a parallel pace, but a slower, at a parallel structure, but a slower pace. And then you could rejoin that high investment, high speed track when you're ready to, instead of having a one-way exit that kind of lets you off in a small town in the middle of nowhere. And if that sounds far-fetched, I'm given hope by a field that actually has transformed in this way. So the field of OBGYN used to be only 7% female. And then those women who were entering that field said, look, this model doesn't work for us because you have to be on call all the time. You see a certain number of patients, and then whenever they go into labor, you have to go to the hospital and stay there until there's a baby. And so this mode of working fundamentally presumes that there's another full-time carer at home with your own children, right? So when women entered this field, they formed group practices where you would see all 5 physicians at some point during your pregnancy who were part of this practice. They would each take a shift on call, and whoever was on call when you went into labor would deliver your baby. Now the field of OBGYN is more than 60% female. So it's now a majority female field. And that's because the technology of how they worked actually changed to make it work for women. Here there was a market force, which was that patients preferred female doctors. But I think there is a market for it, even in law or consulting, because if you are able to make work for women, you're going to be able to offer better services for cheaper because you're retaining better talent. And if women, in their most vulnerable, sensitive moment of giving birth, can accept that they're going to see a doctor other than their primary care provider, I think our clients can learn to accept the boundary that I know you'd like to speak to Judy, but she's not on call tonight. Stella is on call. So I think we need to dream bigger about the structures in the workplace. The way Claudia Golden documented those structures, that was the first challenge. And now our challenge is to ask, can we replace them with something better and more human that works better for all of us? And I'll just end on this slide saying that the book also is about offering individual solutions to kind of make things add up in your own life. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. I kind of talked about the systemic piece here, but the book is about giving you strategies to level up at work and at home to kind of, make it all add up in a world that is fundamentally unfair. But the biggest thing that I also wrote the book for was to send the message that it's not you and it's not in your head. Things really don't add up. What it all is has changed. We're trying to do more than any generation before us, and it really is that hard. So I would love to take your questions now.
Thank you, Corinne. And thank you for drawing attention to that important piece of what we individuals can do. As much as we all know that the real fix is systemic, the reality is it's going to take a while to fix that system for good. And in the meantime, we're all having to navigate it. And you provide such excellent, really clear, concrete, actionable advice in the book. That's not one size fits all, right? You actually provide people a roadmap for how to figure out their own solutions that work for them because we have different preferences, different constraints,
Mm-hmm.
different priorities, and everything else. So, really appreciate that. One of the things that's on our listeners' mind today, going back to the squeeze, which that's such a great concept that you introduced
Mm-hmm.
in the book, is how does it relate to parenting teenagers and support for teenagers? Because it appears that just like parenting infants is much more intensive now than it was 30 years ago, that the world that teenagers are entering social media and everything else is also a lot more intense and requires parental involvement. But it looked like childcare was maybe going down in those later years. So is there any evidence there that the need for care for teenagers is actually increasing, if anything?
Yes, absolutely. We see that in the data. So if you look at, parents who had kids who were over 14 in the past, they were at this point now spending zero time with their kids, right? And now we're spending much more time. So it's still not the peak of those early childhood years, but the difference versus the past, I think that difference is just as wide. And that's because of the sources, as you see, it's helping with homework, it's transporting to activities, and it's helping them process their emotional lives in the way that we hope is building them into, competent adults, but is very intensive in terms of our time. So the key piece of advice that I have for parents there is to really be guided by your values and what you feel are the most important investments. And don't be afraid to say no to the rest. So I think one of the problems is sometimes we're still stuck in the 1970s in terms of our mindset. And we're like, oh, what's important is that the house looks nice and that I make, beautiful homemade meals for every holiday and I hand sew their costumes or their clothes or something like that, right? And we're holding ourselves to this impossible standard because our mom had time to do that because she wasn't reading us bedtime stories or helping us apply to college, right? So if you are making these investments that are so valuable and that are where you are really irreplaceable, then understand that it means cutting yourself some slack in these other domains. So you can't just say, I'm going to be all things to all people. And that's really the biggest lesson of the book is when you figure out your utility function, your values, then you shouldn't compare yourself to other people who are maximizing something else. And of course, it's such a human tendency
Mm,
to do just that.
yeah. Going back to what happens after the most intense squeeze is over. Is it possible that women might just be so tired and frustrated and run down by the mountain of housework and childcare
Mhm.
that they've had to do throughout the squeeze that they just decide not to lean in afterwards, even if they now maybe had the ability to, from a time perspective?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting hypothesis, and it would be worth really gathering some survey evidence here. But anecdotally, I hear so many stories of women who feel like they've been sidelined, who are like, now I have the capacity and I have the time, but there's no way to get back on that track that I was on before. And so when I used to work in consulting, and that's what I saw is that once you stepped out of client-facing work, there was no way to step back into it, right? And so that's where that gender wage gap opens up, is that women are staying in the same industries. You're still technically in the consulting industry, but now you're in a support role instead of a client facing role. And so your wage just isn't growing over time. And so I think it would be really interesting to try to study that and see how much of the barrier is on the side of, women's ambitions or maybe just different values and realizing that that's not the most important thing to them, which I think there's some of that as well, versus how much is them being excluded from those roles and how much of a difference could we make if we change the structure of career paths to say there's just no reason, as people's lifespans and working spans are longer than ever, that we need to make all of these investments in our 30s.
Yeah. There's a really interesting question about whether there is something inherently gendered about these flexibility requirements. So you shared with us the beautiful data that shows that in practice now, women disproportionately take on the caretaking. But let's say it's a single dad, right? Or a main caregiver or go-to parent. Wouldn't they need the same kind of flexibility or boundaries as
Yeah.
women? So is there something inherently gendered about those boundaries?
No, I don't. Yeah, I don't think that there is. And I think that's why when I'm talking to firms, I say that these are things that firms need to consider because fewer and fewer of our workers have that old model where it's a man who has a full-time stay-at-home spouse, right? That is a vanishing portion of our workforce. And so if the setup of your firm is assuming that, if you're assuming, hey, I just have, workers who can give 110% or 150% to work because somebody else is going to take care of the dry cleaning and the meals and the kids, you are going to lose employees to other firms that just have better policies. And so I think putting in place
Mm,
those workplace boundaries and structures, they take into account the reality that more and more of our workers have some kind of caregiving responsibilities and seek and desire a life outside of work, which is something that Gen Z has really been pushing back on, right? So I think in
yeah.
order to be competitive, really offering those boundaries for everybody is a path forward for firms.
Do you have a hypothesis as to why more organizations aren't providing those paths? Because the case is so clear, right? And I think to many of us sitting here, it seems like a no-brainer is you would indeed be able to attract and retain much better talent if you provided those multiple tracks and more of an ability for work to flex up and down over the course of a lifetime, depending on needs and interests outside of work. Why is it not happening?
I think these are the type of things where it's an investment. And with any investment, sometimes the upfront cost is more visible than the long-term gain. And firms tend to be
Mm,
very short-term focused, right? They're focused on like quarterly profits. And to change something, to change the structure of something, it's going to be an investment. It's going to cost you money in the short term. And it's going to pay off, down the line for years to come. And so I think we really have to continue making the case to firms that there is a profit motive. And that's why I think a market force here could be smaller firms or startups that are willing to kind
mm,
of take these risks on these alternate setups because if they can show that they can provide better services for cheaper and have a competitive advantage, that'll provide that market force that actually ultimately transformed the field of OBGYN, for example. So I think that that's what we need to see is some firms taking that risk and then showing that it's paying off. And I think, one of the forces that we saw before was that firms were really competing with the tech industry that had better work-life balance for workers. And that was putting pressure back on kind of some of the firms in other sectors. It's a whole new world right now because the tech industry is now having this very soft labor market with the, advent of AI. And so we're not getting that competitive pressure there. So I think we have to keep the pressure up on firms to kind of consider these alternate paths.
yeah. Corinne, one final question. This has been on the minds of many in our audience today, circling back to this intractable, unequal division of labor at home, the housework gender gap. What are the solutions? Have
Well,
we figured out what works? Things like more parental leave. One of our audience members is saying it appears that men just need to step up and take basic responsibility. But how do we get them to do that?
yes. So, personal solutions, what advice would I offer to you? So, one, parental leave. We can't change parental leave policy maybe in our country, but you can change it in your household. Mandatory 3 months of paternity leave. And some of that has to be taken after mom goes back to work because being the sole parent, right, being the primary parent is so important to having that responsibility really land with you and suddenly actually being the expert in what the baby likes for snacks. So, you're not able to look towards that other person. The second thing I really recommend is tracking your time with with your partner, data is so important to me. And I think getting data in your household can really reveal some inequalities. I liken it to an iceberg where men see the tip of the iceberg and they're like, I'm doing half of this, but there's this iceberg of invisible and routine labor underneath the surface. And when you track your time, you see that when he goes to work, it's work, 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 work. But when she goes to work, it's work, work, call the pediatrician, work, work, order groceries and meal plan on my phone, work, work, and then confirm pickups for the day, right? So tracking your time, make the invisible visible because you can't divide what you can't see. And the last thing that I really recommend is I mentioned Eve Rodsky's Fair Play is trying to divide tasks up root and stem. So don't have a low level junior employee that you're delegating tasks to, but rather let your partner take complete ownership over an entire domain. Like if he does the cooking, then you don't even go near the fridge. You don't even know what's in it. And there's a lot more of that in the book. And that's actually the major focus on the book is kind of trying to navigate this in our own lives because these challenges are so difficult and so intractable.
That's a great note to end on because, Corinne, you have indeed provided us a roadmap for how to fix it and how to make it better. So thank you. Thank you for the wonderful book. And thank you for joining us today for this amazing, engaging talk.